wanted to get an outside perspective of here's Rutherford County, you know nothing about Rutherford County, where are neighborhoods, where are available seats, and what ideas do you come up with? So I say that on purpose. These are not final maps. These are concept maps. That is what the purpose of the next 3 days, and then some of the survey information you're gonna fill out, because Rob is from Wichita. That's where you're from, right? Wichita? Do what? Kansas City. Okay, from Kansas City. I lived in Wichita when I was like 2, so I guess that's why it was stuck in my head. But when we talk about this, they don't know the ins and outs of the neighborhoods. They don't know some of the culture of the neighborhoods. They don't know how some of the boundaries may not be accessible because there's Percy Priest Lake right in the middle of it. We talked about having a ferry system in some of our meetings, if we could use that to help with growth. So we've talked about a whole lot of different things, but that's what these public input meetings are for. The first step was we started last August with looking at enrollment. So what has enrollment done over the last 20 years? What is enrollment going to do in projected areas? The largest spots of growth are going to be in the north end of our county. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody that is representing this area. That's where the largest areas of growth that we are having, pretty much anywhere north of 840 and then the Blackman area. The second step is we had RSP and their team go through every one of our school buildings, look at the space that we're using to figure out how many students can we truly educate in each one of our buildings. So that took several months. And now we're to the final part, is looking at our boundaries and looking to see truly where can we move students around so that we can create seats, and then we truly can tell our funding body, we've used everything that we possibly can. Please help us be able to build buildings, even though they're already doing that in a more aggressive manner to be able to get students where we need them to be. So I will come back and talk about public input after Rob kind of goes over. And so Rob, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Again, I'm Rob Schwartz with RSP. I'm the owner of RSP. I'm gonna take you through quite a bit of information. Again, this is being recorded this evening, so you'll be able to go out on the website and watch this. Put yourself to sleep, maybe, I don't know. But you'll be able to watch it. There are access points for maps and other visuals, other information that will help provide you the appropriate information to understand how did we get to this point? Why are we proposing what would be in each of these concepts? So as we talk a little bit, Dr. Sullivan did a great job of saying a little bit about RSP. With me, I have Jenna Wallace, one of our planners. We have been working in your district. When he says we don't necessarily know your district, I do know a few things, that I wait a lot at lights when it's before school and after school, and even getting here this evening. That's a common thing that you experience in a growing area, right? We exclusively work with school districts all through the Midwest, ranging in all sorts of sizes, helping the districts understand what's happening with your enrollments, your demographics, your development, and just like Dr. Sullivan and the board, ideally not even changing any of the zones. But when we have the situation that's happening in your community, we have no choice but to be looking at changing the zones. And I think one of the things that we're trying to set the stage for in this iteration of what's going to happen, because you heard Dr. Sullivan talking about 1,200 student growth every year, we know there's going to be more buildings that will be needed to be built. And so we're trying to put a plan together that plans for orderly growth, where that's going to happen and how it fits into our boundaries, so that we build the right boundaries for each of your buildings. So why are we here? Enrollment is increasing. That's the first part of this. The second, we're running into capacity of the buildings. Go back and listen to the presentation that I gave to the board on capacity to really dig into the nuance of what is happening in these buildings and how you're uniquely using every single space in some of these buildings in ways that they were not designed, but in ways to try to keep these zones the way they've been here over the last few years. Ultimately, we're planning for some new buildings. So elementary's growing, we have capacity challenges, and so we're also building new buildings. So based in everything that we do, it's data. And so I'm going to take the next few minutes to just kind of give you a sense of how did we get to the ability to say there's going to be a certain number of kids in any development, whether it's single family, multifamily, portable type buildings or whatnot. We have a forecast model that as we look at all of the data sets, so we've met with the city, with the county, to understand the speed by which the developments are coming online. We know where the students are living. We look at data like the census data, the county data sets, city data sets, school district data sets, to try to understand what is changing in each of these areas. Not every place is growing. Some are actually decreasing. All of that information goes back to planning areas. So if you think about where you live, if it's a subdivision, an apartment complex, a mobile home, how many kids are there? How many units are there? What's changing with the demographics? What is that subdivision life cycle? What is the value of the homes there? How quickly are they turning over? Who's moving there? When we look at our past enrollments, we always have a benchmark looking in that rearview mirror. How many kids do we have? And Dr. Sullivan did a great job of just showcasing how much growth we've had since 2005. There's more to come, and I'll show you what that will look like in a moment. We looked at live birth data. This is one of those metrics to understand future kindergartners that may choose to come to Rutherford County Schools. They have other choices, but as we look at the live birth data, what could that potentially mean for the number of future kindergartners? We've looked at migration trends. So how have students come and gone in this case, we're just showing you at the district level, but we look at it with each of the buildings. So the orange part of the bar graphs represent students that were new to the district, whereas the green side represented students that receive services, but no longer receive those services in the year that we're analyzing. And here we have 4 years of data where we're looking at that in and out migration. We do this down to the building level, down by grade, to understand what is that impact year to year. We've looked at things with the decennial census. We have a better understanding of the population that's in your community. We know it's growing. That's represented by the green line. The blue line represents the certificate of occupancies, so when we can actually move into the buildings, and that sets the stage for the number of students that we might have. And then the red line represents the enrollment change that's occurred year to year. And so really the correlation is population's increasing, we're having building activity, and it's continuing to go along even with some of the interest rate increases. And we can talk about that with you one-on-one at the stations. But we know that enrollment also should increase with those metrics. With our conversations with the city and the county, and then most assuredly driving Rutherford County roads and looking for these developments and understanding how many units or where those units are located, we created a map. And this is already out of date. And I can tell you that just from some of the drive that I did today with some of the areas where they just are popping up. So this map is just to illustrate in our model, we're trying to understand this, but as developments happen, as they get access to sewer or water, or as they work through the different planning processes, new projects are coming up. This is from last year. So this leads us to the direction of where we anticipate enrollment growing to. And so when we get out to 27, 28, I think we have a little over 56,000 students. So we said we're right at 50,000 right now, over 50,000, 56,000 students when we get out to 27, 28. The breakdown is shown here. Red is the elementary, blue is the middle school, green is the high school. That purple line is the aggregate of all three. So an immense amount of growth, and growth at each of the levels. Thus, why we're looking at a comprehensive boundary change to try to address all of these issues with the available inventory and those that are already planned with the additions and whatnot. This map is one that you'll want to look at online because you can zoom in and get a sense of where the students are. So if we zoomed in, there's areas where you can see a very high concentration of students, and it's going to be shown on the maps as like this red area, and as it radiates out to yellows and greens, fewer kids. Right here around us, if you're from here, and I imagine most of you are, if you're here tonight, there's a lot of kids here. This has probably some of the highest yield rates that we get from any of the planning areas, but we don't have a lot of buildings that are in close proximity here. causing some of our challenges of what you see on the concepts. You'll also see visuals in this presentation to showcase another way of looking at what's happening with enrollment and how it relates to capacity. So the red dashed line above each bar represents, well, sometimes it might be below the bar, but that represents the capacity of the building. When the bar's above that dashed line, that means we're beyond what the capacity is of that building. And that's the functional capacity. There's lots of conversation that can be had about capacity and how we're using it, where there may be some buildings that we really don't have a equitable experience in art or music or some of the other specials that happen in those buildings because we have just too many kids. The same thing will be at the middle school level. So again, you can see some of the data where the kids are, and the solid colors that you see up here are the existing boundaries. And again, the same situation where we have 5 buildings that are going to be over capacity. And so we're trying to address that with where we have available capacity. But even that said, when we get out to 27, 28, if we don't have some of the items that were listed off by Dr. Sullivan that are not put into what you're seeing in these concepts, we don't have enough space, even if we moved all of the kids to where there is space now. We do the same thing at the high school level. And again, you can see how this relates to the buildings that are going to be over capacity as we look out over the next 5 years. All right, I said I was going to talk a little bit about capacity. You may have seen some numbers in previous board meetings or things that have circulated in committees about capacity of your buildings. So it was really cool when we started out on this process. We first analyzed what was going to happen with enrollment. And then, as Dr. Sullivan indicated, we walked through all of the buildings, we looked at the program schedules, we looked at the floor plans, walked through the buildings to identify how spaces were being used. And I know some of the principals are over here. We had lots of conversations with them, and we were doing it at the end of last school year, and we're still trying to plan for what it would mean this school year. So there was a lot of information that was bouncing back and forth. What does it mean with these additions at the 3 high schools? How does that start to play into how we look at capacity? So a lot of things were happening. And so there's a column that says district pass capacity. So those are probably numbers that you saw that Trey Lee has put together and been using for the district. And I want you to take 2 things from this. One is how the district was looking at capacity, was doing a darn good job at managing how those spaces could get kids in there for the programming that needed to take place. When you look at how RSP examines the capacity, we looked at it 2 ways. One, where it would be brick and mortar, so without portables, and those where if we added portables. One of the goals that the district has is that we would like to eliminate portables. We have a lot of portables in the district, and we couldn't function without the portables. So ideally, we're saying if we're trying to move everyone back into the brick and mortar, we want to use the WO port column. So that's without portables. And even some of these capacities might be a little bit different if we start to look at some of the spaces from an equity lens of what an art room looks like, or what a music room looks like, or how the playgrounds function. So there's a lot of things that still can be done with the capacity, but this got at the metric of how are we using space, and then as we look at realigning the zones, how do we try to get more in accordance, ideally without portables, but knowing that we're not going to get there. We don't have enough timeline or buildings that have been funded for us to eliminate the portables. So if you came here thinking, with everything that you're hearing about in the news media, we're not going to get rid of all the portables. We're going to get rid of some of them, probably relocate it to other buildings in planning efforts for where that growth is. So that's a little bit about capacity. Again, the overview of capacity, I try to look at where we're at in 27, 28. If we just kept with the plan the way it currently is derived for buildings or additions that would be in place in 27, 28. So when I look at the elementary, when I go out to that second column, so that's saying including the future facilities that we are funded for, we're at 90% elementary capacity district-wide. So there's not much space to move around between all of the elementary buildings. When we get to the middle school, even tighter, 99%, basically nothing. a plan to equitably move kids around to all of the buildings when you only have 1% space in 27, 28, very difficult. And then when we get to the high school, we're over 100%. We're at 106%. That's even with the 3 additions that are planned. So there's more work to be done. That's why I want you to take from this slide. This is the first iteration of what is to come as the new buildings come online, specifically if we continue to grow. So again, all of these conclusions, it all comes down to the first slide that I showed you. Enrollment's increasing. We have limited capacity even with our plan, and even with the buildings that are being added, we have to do something more. But we went through a process with what we learned from the data, what we learned from driving through the facilities, and then we had conversations, Zoom meetings with the executive leadership team. And with the executive leadership team, we started to move through some things with what's happening with transportation or where sites were being targeted for some of the new locations. How does that maybe plan into how we look at some of the boundaries, with the idea that we maybe can minimize some of the disruption not only now, but let's say in 5 years, 6 years when these buildings are available. So that's the green boxes on here. But before we started with the green boxes, we had Board of Education meetings, and we helped them set what the guiding principles would be for this comprehensive process. So it's at the elementary, middle school, high school, planning for the additions, planning for another elementary building, planning for another middle school building. But then we also had them prioritize the boundary criteria that would be the metric that we can go back and analyze how well is the concept meeting it. And I will tell you, we've been doing this for 20 years. I guarantee you there will be some of you, maybe the majority of you, that will disagree with something that is about that metric. And you might conceivably be correct from the lens that you're looking at. But one of the things that we were charged with trying to do was comprehensively look at the entire district. Where are our facilities? Where is the enrollment? And how do we start to try to balance this out so we don't have so many kids in the buildings where we're over capacity, and then also demonstrate to the county commissioners that we're utilizing our spaces the best we can with buildings that are maybe underutilized. The orange boxes, this is the most important part, and I really want to say several things that you leave this meeting with. One, you could rest assured there's nothing new that will be said tomorrow or the next night at those public inputs. It's going to be the same information that you're hearing tonight. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to hear from you. And there are ways by which we're going to try to get that information from you that will be very advantageous to my team and also the board and administration, what your thoughts are on why you may like something about a concept or why you may not like something about a concept. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. Some of the metrics that we looked at that we knew were very important to Rutherford County Schools, and it's this ACE concept. We know that there's certain things academically that you perceive and in actuality are getting in those buildings that is a reality to why you like that building. Much like we know there's some cultures in the building that are why you like to send your kids there, why they enjoy being there. And so there's that culture element. We then have this economics factor that is the reality that we can't build all of the buildings in the places where we like to have them in the time frame that they're needed. And so that's one of our limitations. And so that's kind of wrapped around this entire process. When I told you the board did a prioritization of boundary criteria, we said let's choose the top 4. And each of them, you can see what they selected for each of their 4 choices. But generally, they said we have to balance the enrollment with the building utilization. That is a key thing that must happen in these buildings with the limitation of what that capacity is. They then ideally wanted these boundaries to last forever. Well, they're not going to last forever with this type of growth, right? So duration of boundaries is going to be challenging, but they should kind of make sense with how we tried to position them so that as areas grow and new buildings come online, we don't have to do a comprehensive realignment. Then they wanted neighborhoods intact. Now, neighborhoods intact, it's a little bit screwy from your own perspective as you drive through the spaghetti layers of streets on what is your neighborhood. And so we went back to what the legal descriptions are, and so how we identify things as those planning areas. But what that means is they would be assigned the same elementary, same middle school, and same high school. So that way there's continuity of knowing, based on that neighborhood, where are you going to go to school at each of the grade levels. We then wanted to look at some of the demographic considerations that make up what happens in each of these buildings. We didn't want it to be something that was the only low socioeconomic school versus someone that was a higher socioeconomics. And then we had a fifth kind of outlier criteria that people were looking at was this feeder system. And so ideally having an elementary building that completely goes into a middle school and then into a high school. Not possible, but we try to do it as much as we can in what you're going to see in these two concepts. So as I finish up, I just have a couple more slides because the bigger bulk of our conversation is with you all. I wanted to leave you with some of the bigger takeaways that are kind of the drivers of what you're seeing in either of these concepts. And specifically when we look at Stewart's Creek and the Blackman campuses, there's just too many kids. And when you're there, as my team has been for pickup and drop off, and then walking through the buildings with those kids in there, you would know if your kids were there that it's definitely a challenge. When we looked at the Roy Waldron Annex with administration, we think there's some other district programming that would be better suited for that space. So that's one thing that we're trying to look at because there's other program need throughout the district. We're planning for the next elementary to open in 25-26, the next middle school in 26-27, and then the additions to be completed by 25-26. So that's kind of the things that we looked at. I am not going to go specifically concept by concept. I am going to give you some clarity to what you see on the maps that in some ways there's not a lot of information because of just the size of the district, the real estate that we have with a map to populate it with a lot of the things that we ideally would like to have on a map. Specifically, if I zoomed into the LaVergne area, I'd like to know what are those specific streets. So we're working with the district on some other options beyond what you may be aware of for the current boundaries. You can go out there and you can zoom in and see different addresses as it relates to those current boundaries. We're working on something that hopefully might be live tomorrow that you can get some of the granularity that you may need in some of the places where it changes. But what you're going to see on each of these concepts is the solid color represents what is being proposed in that concept for that boundary. Again, everything driving back to those prioritized boundary criteria as our metric of trying to make something better than what we have now and planning for those growths that will occur by 27, 28. When you look closely at the map, there's going to be some dotted lines, and those dotted lines represent what the current boundary is. So when you see a dotted line that looks like it was part of, in this case, since we're showing an elementary boundary, and now it's a different color, you know that that area is changing to a different building. So that's the key things that you're going to see on each of the maps. You're going to see how it corresponds in Concept 1 as we move up to the middle school. And the same thing with the high school. You're also going to have access to some of the data sets that help drive why we're saying this concept meets at least a good portion of what was asked for, but maybe sets the stage for you as the experts that live in the community to provide us feedback. How does that then relate to changes that might be made? I can tell you in the 20 years that I've been doing this, at meetings all through the Midwest, there's going to be something that somebody has that likely changes what's on this concept because of what you know. And it may be things with where crosswalks are positioned. It may be how you get access of how it's difficult to turn out of this subdivision as a left-hand turn at a certain point of day. Those are the things that as you integrate back into the feedback process, that will help. There are some places I can tell you where I've sat, I don't know if it matters if you turn left or right. It's just busy at that time, right? So you're going to see how this relates to the functional capacity of the buildings and the enrollments that's being proposed. And you're going to see this for each of the concepts. What I also want to leave you with is what changed, what got better. And so this is a matrix our team put together so that you can see where we have some improvements, whether it's concept 1 or concept 2. Again, it is not a perfect plan. And I cannot say that enough. It's not a perfect plan because we can't get the buildings built or in the locations we want in the time frame by which we could just naturally say, here's that boundary. So you'll see the breakdown of where we still have challenges that would still be persisting in this plan, but maybe it gets a little bit better.
All right, thank you guys, and thank you, Rob. So a couple things to just hit on before we start looking at some of these maps. I know everybody's been patient listening to all the information, but we felt like it was essential to truly talk about why are we here for everyone to see. We're not trying to hide anything. It's truly, here's the information, here's the seats, here's what we have, what can we do about it? So a couple things. One, this is a phased approach. So it doesn't make any sense for us to rezone elementary school next year when we don't have a new elementary school coming online. All that would do was rezone kids 1 year, and then we open a new elementary school, and then we rezone them again the next year. Outside of that possibility with Roy Waldron that we talked about, that's something we have to look at as a board. Second thing is middle school. Middle school then would not be rezoned until the 26-27 school year. Again, we don't have a new middle school. Hopefully we'll ask for funding for that next year, but it wouldn't open until 26-27, so it doesn't make any logical sense for us to go and rezone kids and then have to rezone them again if a new middle school opened. And then last, and Rob had this a second ago, and I think it's important to talk about, is we've talked about high school additions, we've talked about a new elementary, we've talked about a new middle. The next thing that is missing is a new high school. And that's why you see that he's got it italicized and in bold. More high school capacity is needed to fully resolve our challenges. What is hard is that when you're looking at a high school, it takes at least 2 years to build. So for us to look at a high school, the first kids that would be impacted by a high school are probably 7th graders right now. And they may be seniors by the time we get a new high school. And so that's something that when we look at that is truly a challenge because of the amount of time that it takes to build one. So a couple things that you were looking at. So at all of our stations, there are 4 stations. Every station is the same. So please know every station is the same. They have the same concept maps. It's just a little bit more spread out so that you can see those and not be clustered with one person. We'll have school board members and also a couple staff members at each one to be able to answer and talk through some of these. As Rob mentioned, there is no perfect zoning plan. Our perfect zoning plan is open about 6 new buildings in the middle of neighborhoods, and then we don't have to move anybody. That's our perfect zoning plan. That's not what we're able to do, and not something that looks on the table in the near future. A couple ways to provide feedback that Rob talked about. So one of those, there are large notepads at each station that you can, of course, write on. You can have verbal communication, of course, with district staff and school board members. But the third way is the most important. So there is a QR code, and there's a way for you there at each one of the tables. They're also back there by the maps that we'll have. This is a way for us to be able to collect data across the district. We're doing 3 of these meetings. Again, all meetings are the same, so you don't have to come back unless you want to listen to the same spiel again on Tuesday and Wednesday. We'll be happy to have you, but it'll be the same exact information. But survey is the most important, because that way we can take all of that data quickly, compile it across the district, and see what are our trends. If you're not comfortable with that, that's perfectly fine. You can write it or talk to somebody, and we'll try to relay that information as best as possible. But there is going to be some translation loss between us taking your information as well as you'd be able to say it. And so kind of what are our next steps before we go kind of back to that role? Our next steps is we truly do need public input. These maps, again, are not completed. We need public input to see where some things that our communities see. Rob and his team will take that along with our team over the next couple weeks and make tweaks to our concept maps and hopefully be able to make some new changes that reflect some of the public input. I don't envision we'll be able to make tweaks to all the public input, again, because we just don't have enough buildings in the places we need them. And then last, we'll release those mid to probably end of October, hopefully where our school board can be able to vote on those in November is kind of our plan at this moment. But again, it is a phased approach. Outside of that possible Roy Waldron, LaVergne, Lake, John Coleman area, no one else is really moving schools next year. The middle school, the elementary school will be 25, 26, along with the high school additions. Middle school's another year off of that. So we are, at this point, going to go ahead and, Rob, anything you want to add before we start? Go for it.
Yeah, just a little bit about the survey. So it's a very different survey than what you may be used to if you're used to like a Survey Monkey. So when you hit that QR code, there's like 5 pages by which you can work through, and there's links to maps and your ability to provide information on the elementaries, the middle schools, the high schools, and then give us this wrap up of basically where you're at in some of the general comments. So this QR code, scan that. You can scan that up. We'll probably keep this up as we disperse to the group. So if you're an administrator, board member, if you could go back to the maps that you were assigned. All right, it's a free-for-all. So I'll go to one map. Free for all, exactly. So this is probably the most important piece for us to really know. But I also want, if you have questions before you leave tonight, whether it's something my team can answer or administration, we'd like for that question to be answered. And if we can't, that we somehow find a way back to you in answer to that question as it relates to the rezoning. So that's all I had left. So please disperse to the concept.